right. Well, we are excited to have Jason Turbow with us today. He is the author of 3 books, the latest of which is called They Bleed Blue, Fernandomania, Strike Season Mayhem, and the Weirdest Championship Baseball Had Ever Seen. And Jason, thanks so much for joining us. I want you to know that in light of the last 2 books you've written, the Dodgers book and then the A's book, that I've got a special hat on for you, which is a A's-themed Dodgers hat that I own, that I often am mistaken for and I confuse people with, but I wanted you to know that I'm wearing this for you. And it kind of leads into the biggest question I've got. You're a guy who grew up in the Bay Area, a San Francisco Giants fan, I understand. So help me to understand off the bat how a Giants fan ends up writing books about the Dodgers and the A's.
Sure. Well, I mean, as a journalist, I'm looking for a good story that's undertold, right? With the A's book about the swinging A's of the early 70s, that was a groundbreaking, revolutionary team, and would have been had it been a last place ball club, yet somehow it won 3 straight world championships, the only team other than the Yankees ever to do so, and somehow it hadn't received a book-length examination in a major market publication anyway, since the 70s. So that was kind of a no-brainer. And the same thing with these Dodgers. You know, they won a championship. The season was full of amazing storylines, the strike, and Fernandomania, and Tommy Lasorda's first championship, and the last year of the infield of Garvey, Lopes, Russell, and Say. So there's lots of stuff to talk about there. Somehow that had never received a book-length examination. I think the meat of the answer to the question you were actually asking as a Giants fan is that I was 11 years old when this 1981 season went down. And those were dark days, man. It was tough to be a Giants fan. There was just not a lot of winning going on. So, you know, as Giants fans, we hung our hats mostly on beating the Dodgers because we couldn't beat anyone else. And we could very rarely beat the Dodgers. So we didn't even have that going for us. But that's what we could do. And, you know, I'm the only one of my cousins who doesn't live in LA. You know, my parents are the lone representatives of their various families to leave Southern California. So I'm surrounded by Dodgers fans within my family. And I heard about it nonstop. And, you know, so I knew all about that 81 team. They were a great team, and they were a team that I wanted my favorite team to be like, at least in the standings. And it never could be. So, you know, I knew the broad strokes. I knew all about Fernando Valenzuela. I knew about Jerry Royce no-hitting the Giants, which I listened to live on the radio in 1980, I think. And it wasn't hard to drop myself into that kind of setting. You know, and as a professional journalist now, many, many years later, probably way too many years later, you know, I can let that fandom part of me go in the spirit of telling a good story.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, as somebody myself who I wasn't alive, unfortunately, for the 1981 season. So for a younger audience who maybe is unfamiliar, how would you kind of give a big picture overview of the 1981 season and summarize it in a way that would explain why, as a journalist, you were drawn to this story?
I think I already started to answer that question with my previous answer. I mean, there are so many great storylines here. It's starting with opening day, right? The Dodgers had just lost Don Sutton to free agency. He went to the Astros, you know, their longtime Hall of Fame starter. They expected Jerry Royce to step in atop the rotation. The day before opening day, he strained a calf muscle running in the outfield. So they would have gone to Bert Hooton. But Bert Hooton, thinking he had an extra day to recover, had surgery for an ingrown toenail, and he was knocked out. So they would have gone to Dave Goltz or Rick Sutcliffe, but they had just pitched in the Freeway Series against the Angels to close the spring training campaign. And Bob Welch had bone spurs in his elbow that cost him 10 games. And so from the very first day of the season, we've got Fernando Valenzuela, a 20-year-old rookie who had never started a game in the big leagues, taking the mound for the Dodgers. He's the first rookie ever to start on opening day in 98 years in the whole history of the franchise. And you know, we can get into this while talking about Fernando later, but that started Fernandomania for reasons that will become clear if you don't already know them. And the Dodgers just built on it from there. They built this crazy kind of whirling dervish of momentum that almost put them beyond reach until a mid-spring, kind of a midsummer losing streak cost them almost everything, which brings us to the second part of the story, the strike, right? It wiped out 2 months of the season, right in the middle of the season. And the Dodgers had, a 7 or 8 game lead whittled down to a half a game by the time the strike hit. And it's reasonable to think that if the strike hit one day later, they wouldn't have made the playoffs at all. Because by being in first place when the strike hit, that meant that when baseball adopted a split season format, the champion of the first half will play the champion of the second half after the season to see who goes on in the playoffs. That meant the Dodgers clinched literally in June. And, they didn't exactly coast through the second half, but they didn't feel the pressure to take every extra base and pitch pitchers who might have been hurting a little bit. They could give guys rest when they needed it. And they got blown out in the second half at the very end. The Cincinnati Reds had the best record in the National League that year, but they didn't win the first half or the second half and did not make the playoffs at all. So the Dodgers were beneficiaries of luck. They were beneficiaries of Fernando Valenzuela. And really, they were beneficiaries of an amazingly veteran roster. They had guys able to step in and come through at the big moments. I mean, you're not going to see Rick Monday's name light up the standings, the statistical leaderboards. But when they needed him to hit a home run against Montreal, he hit a home run against Montreal. Guys like Garvey and Lopes and Russell and Say, that whole infield knew that this was probably their last season together. Yeah. And they played like it. And sure enough, it was their last season together.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Just the last little note. It's hard to think of now, with the legend of Tommy Lasorda. But there were actually people questioning whether he might be fired if the Dodgers didn't win the World Series in 1981, because he had failed in 2 other World Series and the team had kind of backslid from there. So it really coalesced everything.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's funny to listen to it as a Dodger fan in 2020, to hear of a Dodgers team getting lucky and sort of, having things break their way when it feels like in the last few years, maybe we've had to some comeuppance on that, if that is truly the case.
It is true. And those players say that their World Series teams in 1977 and 1978, both of which lost to the Yankees, were more talented than the team that ultimately won it in 81. So they definitely got good breaks.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into Fernando. I mean, he's the first word basically in your title. How would you describe what he meant to the team that year, and maybe even more so to the city? Because it feels like that's the far greater impact than maybe to the on the field stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But let's start with the on the field stuff. So this guy comes out from almost literally nowhere. He had pitched a handful of innings in the bullpen as a September call-up in 1980. Didn't make much of a mark. Started on opening day against the Houston Astros, the class of the National League. No one had any expectations. He threw a shutout, a complete game shutout. His second start, 9 innings, 1 run, another shutout, or not shutout, another complete game. Third start, another shutout. Fourth start, another shutout. Fifth start, another shutout. During that fifth start, he went 3 for 4 to raise his season batting average to .438. This guy literally just burst upon the scene, and people ate it up. Fernandomania is what they called it, and by that fifth start, there were mariachi bands in the parking lot and in the outfield, and it wasn't just Hispanic people. Like, their regular fan base was getting in on the act and getting adorned, and people were selling posters and buttons. And in fact, the paperback of They Bled Blue is out yesterday. In the hardcover version, I talk about a button that said, "I live in the San Fernando Valley," with the San crossed out, right? And I had it in my manuscript just the way it should have been, except the typesetter took the strike through on the San to mean, oh, get rid of this word. So in the hardcover, it just says, "I live in the Fernando Valley," which doesn't make a lot of sense.
None.
That's been corrected in the paperback. That's one reason to get the paperback. And people were eating it up. By the end of his first 8 starts, he was 8-0.
Wow.
He'd thrown 9 innings in every single start. His ERA was 0.50. It was the best beginning to a career in Major League history. All right, and this is part of what gave the Dodgers such an insurmountable lead. And as you suggested, in my opinion, and I think kind of empirically, Fernando was actually more important to the team for what he did off the field than what he did on the field. And that is because of Chavez Ravine. The Dodger Stadium, as Dodger fans know, is set right in the middle of this area, about a mile from downtown Los Angeles, which for decades had been home to a pretty vibrant Mexican community. Right? It was affordable. It was close to everything, but the hillsides had made it viewed as kind of undevelopable by local construction contractors. That changed in the 50s. The city attempted to build a housing project, and this was kind of in the days before housing project was a derivative word. Right? I mean, this was going to be a boon for the city, like beautiful apartments and landscaped streets and schools and auditoriums to put low-income housing. And it was going to be great. And they forced a bunch of people off their lands. They coerced them with offers to, to move into this new development once it opened. And those who were not able to be coerced were forced off their land. Before it could ever be built, the Red Scare of communism in the 50s overtook Los Angeles. Subsidized housing was seen as a socialist plot. The entire project was scuttled. The city had to, return millions of dollars to the federal government and grant money they'd already received. And there was a whole community of displaced people now with nowhere to go. And what happened with that suddenly vacant land? Well, Walter O'Malley shortly thereafter decided to move west, and that's where they put Dodger Stadium. So the upshot is the Dodgers were never really able to get a foothold in the Mexican community as part of their fan base in the way they'd wanted. And they knew that demographic was there, right? There was a higher concentration of Mexicans living in Los Angeles County in 1981 than anywhere in the entire world, apart from Mexico City. And the Dodgers tried like mad to find somebody to activate that fan base. They fielded a handful of Mexican players over the years, none of whom were good. They went to other Hispanic players who were not Mexican. The best they could find was Manny Mota, who made a great mark with the Dodgers, but was not the kind of player who could seize an entire community's imagination. It wasn't until Fernando came along that they were able to really activate that Mexican community. One of the famous quotes is from Al Campanis, the general manager at the time, who said he was looking for a Mexican Sandy Koufax. And Fernando gave him a Mexican Sandy Koufax. And to this day, the Mexican community in Los Angeles is one of the stoutest demographics among Dodger fandom. And it continues to make a huge impact.
Jason, is there anyone that you have seen since Fernando that's had that similar of an impact? I mean, obviously not only on the field, but all the reasons off the field you just touched on?
I mean, you can look at people, especially with the Dodgers, like Chan-Ho Park or Ichiro Suzuki with Seattle, who are kind of groundbreaking for their countrymen, and there's a lot of Dodgers caps around Asia because of the player Hideo Nomo. He had a huge impact. But I don't think there's been a Hispanic player who has had nearly that impact. Now, I was talking to Jaime Jarín, the legendary Spanish language broadcaster who actually served as a translator early on for Fernando. And he said nobody in baseball history has single-handedly created more baseball fans than Fernando Valenzuela. Mm. And I find that to be totally believable.
Yeah. In all your time that you sort of spent thinking about this team, writing about this team, was there a particular Fernando story that maybe jumped out at you, whether it's because it was amusing or because it was jaw-dropping or anything along those lines?
It's funny. He didn't talk much. I mean, he was quiet then. He's quiet now. He's not big on interviews. His teammates didn't know at all what to make of him early on, partly because of the language barrier. He spoke no English, and partly because he's just generally quiet. But he was also a fun-loving guy, right? He would sit on the bench and make lariats, lassos out of shoelaces, and yank people's ankles as they were kind of taking steps, and thought that was hilarious. And he developed a nice affinity with Mike Scioscia, his catcher, who spoke some Spanish. And Scioscia, very early on, someone said, okay, none of us can talk to Fernando, as the reporters. Like, what do you say to him when you go to the mound? And he said, well, Fernando only knows 3 words: beer, light beer, and tacos. So I go to the mound, I look at him, I say beer, light beer, and tacos, and I go back behind the plate, and then he strikes the guy out. That's a solid story. That's a solid story.
And it's funny, as you tell all of the impact that Fernando had, as good as he was on the field, it's interesting that as you go through this book, you actually find that Fernando is not sort of the main character, or he's not the star of the show, I guess. And that honor seems to go to Tommy Lasorda. How did you at what point as you were researching and writing this book did that become clear to you, that as much as Fernando might be the one that people remember the most or have the greatest impact long-term, in 1981, it was actually Tommy Lasorda that deserved the most attention?
Yeah, well, he is Mr. Dodger. In my A's book, the biggest figure is Charlie Finley, the team owner, who had this pervasive influence over everything the team did. In that case, Finley was a bit of a villain. And I was wondering if anyone might fill this role as I set out researching the Dodgers book. And it turns out that person was Lasorda, but he's not a villain. He's kind of the hero of the story. But in a not an apples to apples way, but similarly, so much of what he did affected every facet of the organization.
Yeah.
And Lasorda has his shortcomings and had them then, and people would talk about them. But I think that's part of what makes for an interesting character is finding their foibles and learning how they succeeded. And in Lasorda's case, succeeded wildly, despite various personality shortcomings. I mean, he had a lot going on and a lot going for him.
Yeah. And is there, I mean, when I ask you, hey, is there a Fernando story that jumps out? You say, hey, he's a little more quiet. He's a little more reserved. So that might be harder to come by, although you found a really good one. Lasorda strikes me as the opposite. I imagine it wasn't difficult to come across some solid Lasorda stories. Was there one either in the book or maybe that you couldn't put into the book that comes to mind first whenever somebody asks you about Tommy Lasorda?
Well, a couple things. And you know why it's not difficult to find Tommy Lasorda stories is because Tommy Lasorda is so fond of telling Tommy Lasorda stories. They're all over the place. I mean, he's written books about his own stories, and they're good. They're great stories. A couple that speak to me about who he is, and in the facet of being the right guy in the right place at the right time. I mean, Lasorda's a Pennsylvania guy, ended up with the Brooklyn Dodgers, forged an affinity for the organization and came west with them. And it turned out he really loved Los Angeles. He loved the celebrity culture. He loved to hobnob with the movie stars, and was genuinely tickled when he found out that they were as interested in meeting him as he was in meeting them. So one story that comes to mind actually is not completely about Tommy. It's about Rick Sutcliffe. And, at the end of the season, Sutcliffe, who had been the Rookie of the Year in 1979, fell on hard times in 1980. Lasorda informed him that he was going to be left off the playoff roster. And Sutcliffe found this to be a grave injustice and started hurling things in Lasorda's office. And Lasorda's office was itself, a place of wonder, right? Walter Alston, who he succeeded, had this tiny little office where, a little desk in the corner, not much going on. Lasorda took over the trainer's room, the much larger trainer's room, and put up wood paneling and put in refrigerators and beer taps. And he would have post-game meals catered in that office. And on every wall was just covered with photos, right? Mostly of celebrities with signatures to Tommy. So Sutcliffe gets angry and he goes over to Lasorda's bar and he just starts throwing bottles at the wall. And they're crashing one at a time on these frame pictures. And Dusty Baker rushes in to see what the commotion is all about, right as Sutcliffe is picking up a chair and attempting to throw it at a different wall. And Dusty says, Rick, that's the Frank Sinatra wall. And if you throw that chair at the Frank Sinatra wall, you will be in more trouble than you would ever care to imagine. And Sutcliffe realized that Dusty was right and he put the chair down. and that's Tommy. He loved Frank. He loved Frank more than anybody. Tommy, meanwhile, was cowering behind the desk through all of this. And the other detail I think of in terms of Lasorda and celebrity has to do with a return plane trip from Houston that year during the playoffs. They had lost 2 straight in Houston to start the playoffs in a best-of-5 series, right? They were on the cusp of being eliminated almost immediately. They're flying back, and Lasorda sidles up to Steve Garvey on the team plane. He's like, hey, want to go with me to dinner when we get back to LA? And Garvey says, sure. And so they go to a restaurant and walk straight to the back, and it's a private room. And sitting in the private room are Frank and Barbara Sinatra just waiting for them. And they have this very nice dinner at which Garvey looks at Sinatra and says, we have them right where we want them. And sure enough, the Dodgers won 3 straight in LA, and then, climbed out of another hole against Montreal in the playoffs, and then climbed out of another hole against the Yankees in the World Series to take it all. But that confluence of celebrity and the A-list room they had in the back of the restaurant and the confidence to overcome any obstacle all kind of coalesced there.
That's amazing. That's any story that involves Frank Sinatra and Steve Garvey and Tommy Lasorda and baseball. I mean, it's like the confluence of things that are happening in that story. It's amazing. It's interesting for me, again, as somebody who didn't live through the 1981 team. as somebody who was born after and looking back, it feels like, and I'm curious to hear if you agree or not, it feels like the 1981 team and season maybe gets overlooked in the history books as far as from a Dodgers perspective, especially. And partly that's probably because 1988 was the most recent title and because of Kirk Gibson and some of the stuff that happened there. Why do you think that is? Is it because it was a strike shortened season? Is it because it was sort of a weird kind of lucky maybe scenario? Or do you disagree? Is the 81 season, do you think, remembered appropriately?
No, I don't think it's possible to disagree. There's no question that 88 is remembered far more prevalently in the minds of Dodgers fans. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I spoke to saying, oh, I'm now writing a book about the 1981 Dodgers. And the instant reply is, oh yeah, Kirk Gibson. I'm like, no, not Kirk Gibson. And there's a few reasons. One, that iconic moment of the home run against Dennis Eckersley is seared into everybody's consciousness. Partly because television was more prevalent in 88 than in 81. Partly because the Dodgers were such an underdog in 88 and LA was able to kind of seize upon those characters. Partly because I think these Dodgers teams, the players that made up the 81 team are more associated with the 70s teams that didn't win the World Series than they are with the 81 team, right? We think about Reggie Jackson hitting the 3 home runs in the World Series against the Dodgers. And then that's sort of how I picture most of these players. So shifting that into 1981 takes a little bit of effort. And there's a lot of reasons, but there's definitely no question that it exists.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it is interesting just in the grand scheme of history, how that plays out. And it's interesting just to think about. I mentioned this sort of before we got on, how you wrote a book about a strike shortened season. Here we are in 2020, where we're looking essentially at best case scenario, a shortened season. How does sort of all the time that you spent talking about the 1981 season, how does that maybe influence the way that you think about what we're not necessarily we're facing as far as the virus and all that, but just the prospect of, let's say, 100-game season? How does that influence the way you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to look at that from my perspective with They Bled Blue. One is, how will baseball deal with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 1981, they had to figure out, how do we make sense of this season? Because there were advocates for just continuing where they left off, as if there had been no break, and crowning one champion like they always had. That would have led to wildly imbalanced schedules, right? Because some teams had much harder first halves than second halves. They ended up with this split season format where the first half champion played the second half champion, which was itself imperfect. Again, because schedules were imbalanced and not every team played every other team the same amount of times or things like that. Not every team even played the same amount of games as every other team. But this was the best they could come up with, and that's what gave us our first division series. Right? It was just one division at a time then. So that's one part of it. How to make an equitable schedule upon baseball's return, whenever that may be, and if that just looks like picking up on June 15th, where the calendar said to pick up, or do you recalibrate everything?
Yeah.
There were suggestions, maybe we just play intra-division games for the whole second half. This is 1981, just to give every team a chance to get back in it. And there's lots of ways to balance everything. The other way I've been thinking about it a lot is from the media aspect. I mean, how are we going to fill all those TV hours and all those column inches with content now that there's no baseball to cover? And people got really creative back in the 80s. They were, the LA Times reran stories of classic Dodgers games. And one of the newspapers actually ran effectively a fantasy league, like a computer simulation. I remember Gary Allenson, the Red Sox catcher, who was a Los Angeles native, his father, or he requested to the newspaper that he hit a home run on Father's Day in honor of his father, and then they acquiesced. They wrote it into the story.
Why not?
Why not, right? So we see people getting equally creative today. For the first week of the pandemic, I emptied my hard drive of snippets, good stories from the baseball codes that didn't make the final cut of that book. And I just started tweeting that out like mad, just to give myself something to do, to give people something to pay attention to. And you see MLB Network is just playing classic game after classic game. We're trying to have some fun during this.
Yeah.
Has anything, Jason, changed for you since writing the book, kind of how you consume baseball now?
No, not really. I mean, I've been doing this professionally for 25 years now. So sitting in a press box is a very different experience than sitting in the bleachers. And they're both great in their own time. But I cannot mistake working at a baseball game for being in the stands at a baseball game. Like when I go to a ball game now as a fan, I'm louder, I think, than I ever have been because I can finally let it out. I mean, I was at the 2010 World Series clincher in Texas for the Giants, where they broke that that long streak of futility, and I was covering it. And because I was filing so many stories for the little outlet I was working for, I was in the press box, and I just had to keep it all bottled up. And it wasn't until I left the stadium and got into my rental car that I could close the door and just let loose and whoop and holler. So now when I go to a ball game, I kind of like to be that guy, at least a little bit more than I used to be. But from the writing the book standpoint, I mean, it's all good. I mean, it helps you understand the history better, and I love the baseball history.
So in addition to writing about the 81 Dodgers, you also have a book out on sign stealing. And ironically, we've kind of come full circle now with both, where you might be facing a shortened season this year for different reasons than the 81 strike.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Houston Astros, they were caught stealing signs, and the Dodgers were one of the victims of that. What's it been like for you to kind of see two of your books sort of come full circle?
Yeah, it's a little bit nutty. I mean, so my first book was The Baseball Codes. It came out in 2010, and it was about the unwritten rules of baseball. Everything from, retaliation for various things to, not stealing a base with a big lead late in the game. And there's lots of kind of granular details and gray area where people discuss what's right and what's wrong. I have an entire chapter on sign stealing, and I have an entire chapter on sign stealing from beyond the stadium boundaries, right? Which is really where this comes home to roost, because sign stealing itself is really interesting, but it's not really frowned upon. I mean, as we've all heard ad nauseum over the last 6 months, if you're going to pinch my signs from second base, that just mostly means I need better signs. But what the Astros did is above and beyond. As I found out researching my book, teams have been doing that kind of stuff since the early 1900s. They would station people in apartments beyond the outfield wall with spyglasses, homing in on the catcher, and they'd open and close window shades to signal to the hitter. The scoreboard in Chicago in the 50s, the famous exploding scoreboard, they had a light that could only be seen from the home dugout and the plate, but couldn't be seen from the visitor's dugout, so it would be harder for anyone to know what's going on. Lots of that stuff has been going on. What's different with the Astros is the degree to which they were doing it. They were stealing with this high-tech video installation, and then the banging on the trash can was just next level, right? For most of these other sign stealing occurrences, you still had to relay it to somebody on the field to relay it to the hitter. And there's still at least, a degree of acceptability. And from what I understand of the Red Sox report, which has yet to be released, that's more or less what they did, which is why it's not going to be met with quite such a severe reaction as the Astros. But when the Astros started banging on that trash can, and then we found the video evidence repeatedly of them banging on that trash can,
right.
It's like nothing anyone has seen. I mean, you guys saw the reaction, not only from the Dodgers clubhouse, but from clubhouses across baseball.
Yeah.
All players don't slag on each other like that. One guy's not going to criticize a whole other team in the way that everybody around baseball has been criticizing the Astros. And then they showed up for spring training and had that lame apology day, and it just made them look all the worse. So, yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but not playing baseball might actually benefit the Astros, because they were going to get it. They were going to get booed by everybody all the time. They've become the bad guys in ways that they pretty well deserve. And by the time baseball comes back, I think everyone's going to be so happy to see baseball that the hard edge of that initial reaction may have been worn off a little bit.
Yeah, and as Dodger fans, we're all going to say very, very much too bad on that front, because the worse that lives are for the Astros, the better for us. Well,
yeah,
Jason.
Well, on the flip side, I mean, I'd like to know from your end, as Dodger fans in Los Angeles, I'm here in Northern California. When I heard the LA City Council had a resolution to award retroactive championships to the Dodgers, was there like a groundswell for that, or is that just a couple lone wolves trying to make a name for themselves?
Yeah. I don't know. Lone wolf even seems like an overstatement of these people. I mean, it was like the most embarrassing thing. I think I had text messages coming in from friends like, what on earth? And it's like, just all you could do is shake your head and say, look, we have enough like news that we can just put out there that makes the Astros look terrible and highlights how insincere their apologies are. Like we don't need to go and make a mockery of ourselves by declaring ourselves champions according to the city councilors of Los Angeles or whatever the plan was. And so, yeah, I mean, my thing was I never wanted the Dodgers to be awarded the World Series. It was just a matter of what justice looked like. I don't know, but it was never that. So anyways, that was sort of a silly story that, yeah, definitely probably made more headlines than it deserved.
And frankly, I don't even know how that sort of came to be. I mean, I think maybe the city council was just thought they would get the fan support, but in talking to fans and even Dodger players, nobody wanted that. There was an argument for, maybe there should have been harsher penalties for the Astros, but really I didn't find one person who said, yes, absolutely award the Dodgers the World Series retroactively. So that was definitely very strange.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, justice has to be on the Astros end of things.
Yeah.
It can't be on the Dodgers end of things. I mean, even if they were awarded like a compensatory draft pick, that would seem to not really make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, Jason, we appreciate your time. Let me get you out of here with 5 rapid fire questions. As much as possible, we'll try to make these rapid fire, but some of these are related to your book or the Dodgers. Some are related just to baseball or life in general. So the first one's an easy one. Who's your favorite baseball player of all time?
Johnny LeMaster.
Okay. The best baseball player that you've interviewed in your career? Not like best talent wise, but the best interview.
Best interview. I mean, I'll just go recent, man. Dusty Baker is everything he looks like on TV. I spent hours with him at his house, luckily between his time with Washington and his time with Houston. And he filled me in like nobody's business on that team.
Awesome. The best baseball book that you'd recommend that isn't your own?
Ball 4.
Oh, it's great.
Boughton just passed away. R.I.P. There's a new biography on him about to come out. But Ball 4 is amazing, and I'm partial to Boys of Summer. Even as a Giants fan, before I was ever writing a Dodgers book, I loved that book.
Okay. Is there anything in this book that a Dodger fan might be surprised by? Is there anything that's like breaking news or sort of a peek behind the curtain that maybe it hasn't been presented before? I mean, I know your book's been out for a little while, but somebody who hasn't read it yet.
I take a little bit of a look at the culture in LA in 1981, which was very cocaine heavy. And that affected its professional sports teams as well. So there's some stuff about that. One detail I uncovered that I hadn't heard anywhere else that I love was just prior to spring training, Darryl Thomas, the super utility infielder, was actually apprehended on a stolen yacht in San Diego Harbor, which he got endless grief for when the team arrived for spring training, literally like a week or two later. It turns out he didn't steal the yachts. I mean, his friend had given him the keys and it was repossessed in some high level, bank situation. But he happened to be driving a stolen yacht, which you can't say about many ball players.
No.
But you can say it about those 81 Dodgers.
There you go. Okay, last question. We'll get you out. What's next for you? Do you have another book coming down the pipeline?
I should have had news on that front by now, but the pitch process in the publishing industry has taken a marked decline in rapidity of making decisions on anything. So lots of irons in the fire, but nothing to report yet. Something soon, hopefully.
Okay. Well, we appreciate your time. Let us know, where can people find you online, find the book, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I blog repeatedly about the unwritten rules at baseballcodes.com and Twitter at baseballcodes. As part of this sequestration, the self-isolation and no baseball, a bunch of us baseball authors who have books coming out this spring have started something called the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, in which we're interviewing each other about our books in place of bookstore appearances, because where else can we have these conversations? We just launched last week. We've already got several conversations up. We've got a bunch more coming. You can buy all our books there at pbbclub.com, pandemicbaseballbookclub.com. We're on Twitter. And we're trying to drive a lot of traffic toward independent bookshops, which need our help now more than ever.
Okay. Well, we appreciate your time once again. Thank you. Good luck with the book. Again, you guys can go find this book probably anywhere that books are sold. They Bleed Blue is the title. Jason Turbow is the author. Jason, we appreciate your time. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having me on. You too.